All right, listeners, you can't see this, but Rob just sipped his tiny little coffee in his Parisian office across the Atlantic away from the hustle and bustle and chaos of U.S. presidential elections. I'm jealous, Rob, that you don't get the front row seat for what's going on in the U.S.
No, I'm just sitting around and watching it all go down from my perch. So what are you seeing up close?
I don't know about up close, but I had some people reach out and suggest that I should have done a reaction podcast to the assassination attempt. And actually, I think it's always funny to talk about how you know things are happening. Like I was sitting at the dinner table with Megan and Annie, and my phone just starts blowing up, and I was annoyed. I was like, "Oh, it's probably these spam callers or something else like that." And we're cleaning up the dinner table, and I look down, and I've got like my sister and my best friend and like another friend, like turn on CNN, like all this other stuff. So I turn it on and I start watching what was going on. But I didn't do a reaction podcast for a couple of reasons. Number one, I didn't really want to interrupt my family dinner. Number two, I found it hard to reach an enlightened plane of objectivity on this. Like I couldn't separate my own personal feelings about the race from the analysis, which is what I consider my superpower. I can usually just like lock into that straight away, and I couldn't do it. It was taking me days to sort of separate personal feelings from analysis, and the last thing I felt like people needed was more personal feelings out there. And the other thing was, and this is where I maybe want to begin the conversation, because as I finally have reached that enlightened nirvanic plane. Is nirvanic an adjective? I just made it one. If it's not,
Sure.
you should have. Is it an adjective? Okay, anyway. But it's sort of, as an analyst or as somebody who's trying to talk about what all this means, it's difficult because the impulse is to point out that this has happened. This is relatively common in U.S. presidential politics. So 4 sitting presidents have been killed in office. That's 8.8% of the presidents that have ever served, 45 presidents overall. There have been attempts on 15.5% of presidents in office. If you count Huey Long and Bobby Kennedy, both of whom might have become president, if not assassinated as candidates on the campaign trail, now we're up to 20% of presidents, or at least presidential elections, being impacted by assassination attempts. And that doesn't include all of the sort of zany attempts that sort of got close but didn't really go anywhere. There were 3 that I picked out that I had no idea about. When Herbert Hoover was touring Chile, a group of Argentine anarchists were plotting to assassinate him. It didn't go particularly well, but that was an assassination attempt. William Howard Taft, there was an assassination attempt against him while he was meeting Porfirio Diaz on the border of Texas and Mexico.
Oh, come on. You couldn't hit Taft. The man was the size of a truck.
Well, no offense to Trump, but Trump's not exactly that much smaller than him. No matter how much he cuts his suits, they probably use the same bathtub. I watched an interesting video about how Trump like tailors his suits to not appear as fat as he is, by the way. But anyway, we can save that for our style podcast that we're going to launch on the side of this. The most interesting was, did you know that, you might know this because I know you read that book about Harry Truman. I think it was McCullough that wrote it, that 2 pro-Puerto Rican independence activists tried to assassinate Harry Truman while he was living in Blair House. And a couple like officers or police officers got killed. Like it was actually, they got fairly close to Truman. And Truman actually commuted the death sentence of one of the guys, and then Carter commuted the sentence to time served, which was interesting in general. All of which is to say, there's one impulse in me, the analyst, which is to say, this is really not that uncommon. Like, it's not that big of a deal. It's not evidence of American politics deteriorating and degenerating, especially because it looks like it was a lone wolf, crazy 20-year-old who got access to an AR-15, which really means this is a mental health and gun access issue, not a degradation of our political norms issue. At the same time, it is an attempted assassination attempt, which got really close. I mean, a couple inches, and we're in a completely different ballgame. I've had multiple friends reach out and say, "Oh, we just narrowly averted a civil war. Can you imagine what would have happened if Trump had actually died, and what this would have meant for conflict between the left and right?" And I don't have an easy way of refuting that. And it's also worth pointing out that even if assassination attempts and assassinations themselves of U.S. presidents are common, they've been responsible for massive political shifts. So the last time a U.S. president was actually assassinated, think of Kennedy. None of the civil rights movement, maybe the Vietnam War, so many things turned on Kennedy dying and Johnson being elevated and using that political groundswell to get a huge majority in Congress and to push everything through. We probably live in a very different country if Kennedy doesn't get assassinated, just because Johnson doesn't get to do all those things, and in both good and bad ways. With probably Vietnam doesn't go the way that it does. We probably don't have civil rights until the 70s and 80s at least. Like it's a complicated one. And the one that I wanted to bring up to you and throw at you to sort of start the conversation about the assassination itself and then delve down into some of the impacts was William McKinley and the transition from McKinley to Roosevelt, because I think this is the one that actually has the biggest overtones to what we're talking about here. McKinley was kind of a standard U.S. politician, but he himself, as a Republican, he oversaw a major shift in Republican politics. He promoted tariffs, especially in 1897. He had a big tariff called the Dingley Tariff, which was supposed to protect manufacturers and factory workers from foreign competition. Sounding familiar at all? In 1900, he secured passage of the Gold Standard Act. The U.S. had been on gold for a couple decades at that point, but he was the one who actually formalized it, and we remain on the gold standard until FDR takes us off in 1932, 1933. He fights the Spanish-American War, which is a quick and decisive victory for the United States. That's where you get Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines. Cuba, the whole Cuba issue starts then. He annexed the Republic of Hawaii in 1898. But then he gets gunned down in office, and Teddy Roosevelt, one of the youngest, he might have been the youngest president in history. I didn't actually go back and look if he was the youngest or not. I think he was the youngest because he was in his early 40s. He takes over, and he is the leader of a progressive movement that champions, if you know your history, you know that his big policy was the square deal domestic policy. So he wanted fairness for all citizens, which included breaking up trusts. We talked about trusts on the podcast last week, regulating railroads, purifying food and drugs. He also did things like establishing national parks. He's the one that pushes for beginning construction on the Panama Canal. He expands the U.S. Navy, sends the Great White Fleet all around the world, and he really changes the direction of U.S. politics as this populist politician, who again was a young firebrand who just gets thrown on to the McKinley ticket, which that sounds an awful lot like J.D. Vance too. So you have this a realignment in Republican and Democratic politics where some young firebrand is taking over because the McKinley himself gets taken out. I'm not saying that's exactly what's going to happen, but it feels like an interesting analogous transition moment where an assassination attempt is in there. So I don't know. Why don't I throw it over to you? Because I honestly, that's where I've landed. I cannot decide whether this is a big deal or whether we haven't had a significant assassination attempt of a president or a candidate since Reagan in 81. Kind of do, honestly. Like it's been like you don't go that many decades in U.S. history without this sort of thing happening. So I don't know whether to say, like this has happened before, or no, this is going to change the race in meaningful ways, and it's going to usher in Trump and Vance and MAGA and give them a runway for the next 2 to 4 years where they could make a lot of change because of the sympathy groundswell or the Republican unity that's going to follow them as a result of the attempt. So I'll throw it to you there. I rambled a little bit at the end, but I'm curious which direction you would take it, or if there's another direction I haven't thought.
Well, before I take it in any direction, I'm just really curious. Why do you think, if the U.S. has a much higher baseline of this happening in its history than other, liberal democracies, what is it about the U.S. that's unique? I mean, do you have a theory? I know we don't know the answer, but what do you think?
I haven't looked at the data, and I would have to go back and look at the data. So maybe I'll go back and we can talk about it next week. But my instinct would be that this is not strange for liberal democracies. I would assume that liberal democracies have plenty of assassination attempts. I mean, this didn't get nearly the same coverage, but somebody tried to take out, I believe it was the Slovak prime minister a month ago, 2 months ago. I'm sure there's all types of people that are plotting against Emmanuel Macron and have been. So, I mean, I think when you're in liberal democracies where you don't have authoritarian security states that are monitoring everything, the flip side of that is that people have closer access to their politicians, and so that they can express that violence in those ways. And the other So, interesting is the wrong word, but when you go through the list of all these different assassination attempts, I mean, some of them are politically motivated, like that Truman Puerto Rican independence one. Some of them are just crazy people. And this one is a crazy one. This is not some organized political movement that was trying to take out Trump. It would be a lot more serious if it was an organized political movement that wanted to take him out. Just a couple years ago, Shinzo Abe was gunned down while he was sort of in the streets of Japan. That's a massive sort of thing. So I don't think the United States is particularly special in this regard. What separates the United States from most countries is gun access. So when there are going to be assassination attempts, they will probably be more deadly because would-be assassins have an easier time getting weapons. But I don't know. Not even that's really true. Like Abe died. Fico was hurt much more than Trump was. I don't know if you saw it. There was they've been doing the background on the shooter of the guy who tried to take out Trump. And apparently he tried to join like his high school rifle club or some kind of, maybe it wasn't his high school. He was trying to join a rifle club and they wouldn't let him join the club because he was so bad that they thought it was dangerous. They wouldn't be able to hit the broadside of a barn, which turned out to be the case. He couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. So anyway, the answer to your question is I don't think the United States is particularly unique in this. I think that one of the pitfalls of open political systems is that people, including crazy people with guns, have more access to their politicians than they would in Russia or in China.
Well, let's go back to the historical context and try to tie this into sort of what's happening with policy in the upcoming election, because I think it's an interesting area to go down. So, if we stay on McKinley and Roosevelt for a little bit, I think it's an interesting comparison because, at that time we were sort of in the evening of a long era of U.S. policy, and what I mean is, the Civil War obviously was about slavery, but in many ways it was about sort of what kind of economic system did the U.S. want to have. And the southern states favored a more free trading system because they had the sort of lowest cost agricultural base, and they could export into England and the other developed countries and import manufactured goods. And they were very happy to do that. And up against that philosophy was the sort of Hamiltonian approach of nourishing America's infant industrialization, its infant companies, its infant industries through tariffs. And if you look, the level of tariffs back then versus anything you see today was just off the charts. I mean, the U.S. I think had high 20% tariff uh, average percentage, before the Civil War. So, we don't have to go on and on about tariffs and have that conversation again. But I think just it's important to understand that the context of this was as you went into the McKinley years and into Roosevelt's early career, the background was okay. You've had decades of high tariffs, and the U.S. had industrialized. The U.S. had emerged as a leading industrial economy at that point, and the issue had transformed from we have to nourish these little seedling companies so they can compete with the big bad British to oh my god, these trusts have been gotten out of control and they're controlling too much of the economy, they're too powerful, we've expanded too much, and now we have to deal with sort of redistribution and fairness and issues like that. And that was sort of accelerated that process when McKinley was assassinated and Roosevelt came in on that platform. There was a firm groundswell supporting that, and that's sort of gave him the momentum to go and make huge policy changes. So I bring this up because I think it's a very different situation today, and not just because Donald Trump was not assassinated, which I think when someone dies, you get a huge sympathy vote. You get a huge, sentimental boost. When JFK died, obviously it was a national trauma. So my guess would be that this is something that, given how crazy, the news cycle becomes as we continue in our volatility spiral, which we've talked about, I would not be shocked if this was something that 6 months from now was not top of mind for most people. I don't know. What do you think about that before we go into the other policy stuff?
I hear you, and that was honestly my first instinct. But to push back and put on the devil's advocate hat here, I think the thing that it really does change is that unless Biden steps down, and he doesn't look like he's stepping down, and unless the Democrats can find someone to reset the race, I don't think Kamala is going to do it. I mean, they need to reset the race somehow, and unless they can make it interesting over the next couple of months. Um, what this has done is that it sort of removes all doubt about Trump, and it underlines Biden's weaknesses at the same time that it underlines Trump's strengths. It's honestly like a novel. I don't think you could have written a book any better with a plot of Biden's debate performance next to an attempted assassination attempt, all the legal stuff. So I mean, some of the legal cases against Trump have also been dropped. So it's just like sort of this perfect thing, which seems to be leading to this inevitable conclusion. And I say that because the election has been a toss up until this point. And I think we're now teetering towards a scenario where it's not going to be a toss up, where it could be a landslide. And you could get a Trump Vance ticket that marches in with the House and with the Senate. And so you're right that in 6 months, we won't be talking about the assassination attempt, but the assassination attempt and, Trump emerging from the Secret Service with the fist raised versus Biden completely incapable not only of completing sentences but being aware of his own mental degradation, like those two images next to each other and what that's going to do in the race. That we'll be talking about that for generations in American politics, because if Trump can do that, if he can ride in on a landslide and have both houses, they can do some major things, make some major changes in U.S. politics, which is where the Roosevelt comparison comes in too. And I should have said also, the reason I like this is because Trump is not a spring chicken himself, as my mother would have said. He's only 3 years younger than Biden. So even if something totally normal happened, like what if he had a heart attack, or what if he had some kind of health episode, and you could propel someone like J.D. Vance in, who J.D. Vance is much more of an ideologue than Trump. Now, he's also very flexible. He was a never Trumper 8 years ago. Now he's a pro Trumper. But I mean, this guy's talking about, and we'll talk about this more, I know, but devaluing the American currency. I don't know if you watched any of the Republican convention. They were having Teamsters, speak about economic terrorism. And I mean, it was just like the free trade Republican Party is gone. Like it's just been completely co-opted. So you can imagine a universe in which somebody like Vance is at the top, whether because something happens to Trump or in 4 years he's the anointed successor, and then you're off to the races. So I think my answer to you is yes and no. Like the assassination attempt itself will probably fade into memory fairly quickly, but the political reality it's going to create, unless the Democrats do something to stop this train, is going to last a lot longer than 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely. My assumption coming in was that Trump was assumed to win, and then this just 100% confirmed it. But let's talk about this, because like what matters for us is really policy. Like what's actually going to be enacted. But like it's nice to talk about politics, but I think to keep it in the realm of investments and how this impacts the day to day of people listening to this, like what are these guys going to do? That's the real question. And I would take a different view, because just harkening back to the conversation we had last week, my theory is that Trump's great success has not been because he's presented any particular idea, and his ideas change all the time. His success is as positioning himself as, and by extension, positioning the people who support him as sort of insurgents against a corrupt elite. And this certainly supports that. Hey, I'm sure there's a lot of people who think that the corrupt elite contributed to his assassination attempt. For whatever it is, there's going to be conspiracy theories, because that's what people want to believe, and that's why he's so remarkably popular, because he's thumbing his nose at policy idea people who are out of touch. That's the perception, which is why I think I don't necessarily expect, if you had Vance or one of the other people who do have ideas, Robert Lighthizer, for instance, I don't think that that's going to resonate in the same way. So if Trump were out of the picture and all of a sudden, like we said last week, I think Trump's going to do whatever he thinks is popular. Like, I don't think he is an ideologue at all, but these guys are. These guys are leading with ideas, and some of their ideas are really stupid. So all of a sudden, you're getting back into that world of like, oh, my ideas versus your ideas, and you lose all the impetus, all of the power of it's me against the coastal, woke, ridiculous, latte sipping assholes, and all of that emotional stuff, which has been the source of pretty much all political success in the last 15 years. So um, I think we need to talk about, if Trump is elected, which it looks like at this point he very likely will be, what will they do? But the notion that like, oh, this is going to sweep in, like Roosevelt created a legacy because like people were hungering for those ideas. He had better ideas that were suited to the time. I don't think that's the case here. And we can talk about what J.D. Vance sort of represents, what Robert Lighthizer is proposing, and why I don't think that's going to fly with the American populace once it actually hits. And I think that's a good way to go down. But the notion that like all of a sudden Trump's just going to open the window to these ideologues who have very specific policy platforms, and then they're going to be able to do whatever they want for some undefined period of time because it's like the 1960s Great Society over, and they just have so much goodwill. I don't buy that. I don't think that's going to play out like that.
Yeah, that's fair, and we should delve more into that. And I think it's good to start talking about the things that they are going to do. It's also interesting to point out that you're right that Roosevelt's policies were very popular, but he didn't get elected that first time. It was McKinley. It was sort of the older statesman, and it was a real reorganization around like the Republican Party captures manufacturing and industrial states during the McKinley administration. It's the big change. It's the moderate Republican wing taking over from the radicals after the Reconstruction of the Civil War era. And maybe people hungered for some of Roosevelt's ideas, but he lost when he tried to form his own progressive party, 10 years later after he leaves office. World War I throws a monkey wrench into all of this. So if you hadn't had World War I, maybe the U.S. economy goes in a different direction. But because of World War I, the U.S. federal government, for the first time really in U.S. history, aside from the Civil War, takes over the machine of the U.S. economy and produces things for the war effort. And then you get into the 1920s and the Great Depression. So, like, maybe there was a groundswell of support for some of those policies, but at the same time, it's not clear to me that they weren't stupid either. Like 20 years later, the United States is on its knees in the context of the Great Depression. And it's a different Roosevelt has to come in and completely reset the board and refound the American Republic, both politically and economically. But I don't think it's possible to win that argument one way or another. Well, so let's talk about some of the policies. We've talked about tariffs, and should we talk a little bit about tariffs now, or you want to go straight into the dollar?
I think it's worth rehashing the tariffs discussion because it's such an important one, and it looks very likely that that's going to be a major tool that they use.
So what the Trump administration has said, this is what they've said, is 10% tariffs across the board, every single country, and up to 60% tariffs on China. Now, the devil is in the details. I have no idea how legally they can push a 10% tariff across the board for all other countries. They could probably push 60% for most imports from China. Like they've got the old Department of Commerce investigations and the national security consensus all around that. But the idea, for example, that you're going to slap 10% tariffs on Canada or on Mexico, like, okay, you're going to violate the US Mexico Canada free trade agreement. If you do that, you're going to slap it on European allies or or Japan or countries like this. Like legally, I don't know exactly how that works. And some of Trump's former officials have been talking about, oh, well, we'll try it and then it'll have to be adjudicated in the courts, but that won't happen for 100 days or something like that. So then we'll see what happens in the interim. But that's what they're talking about. They're talking about increasing the cost of imports abroad significantly, not just from China.
So just to put this into context, this data is from the World Bank. To understand what a 10% tariff would look like relative to other countries. So France, notoriously overprotected France, the average tariff rate today is 1.4%. So that's the weighted average tariff. In other words, if you take everything that they import and do a weighted average of what the tariffs are, it's 1.4%. In the US, it's 1.5% today. So France is actually a little bit lower. Japan, the famous mercantilist superpower, 1.8%. Turkey, 3%. Korea, 5%. India, 6%. And then Brazil, the notorious, custo Brazil, as they say, everything costs more because of these tariffs, 8%. So if they were to do a 10%, they would be sort of, significantly above Brazil. Just to give a sense, like 10% sounds like, oh, well, whatever, that's a rounding error, right? No, that's a huge change. It's a huge amount. So what does it mean, right? If they were to do that, effectively what it does is it takes money out of the pockets of households and it puts it into the pockets of business. Is that a good thing right now? I think is the question. That, this is really hard to explain like in a narrative, because this is sort of picture an equation where you change certain things and then the whole equation changes. In certain cases, tariffs can be good if you have a lot of, excess capacity that's not being used, for example. If you have orphan industries that need sort of a tariff wall behind which they can have the comfort to invest in capacity building and that sort of thing. The problem is there's no evidence that US business has any problems with that today. We've just had an investment boom, as we talked about last time. US business profit margins are near all-time highs. So the problem that's going to emerge is tariffs are okay when they give US business, or when they give business a kick in the butt to invest and expand capacity because they need that. We're in the opposite situation today. So you're going to get all the negative, which is immediately upon creating a tariff, the cost goes up to the consumer like that day, right? And then you're hoping that, okay, well, that'll be offset because US businesses will go, and the stuff that it no longer makes sense to import from China, we're going to build a factory in South Carolina and we're going to build that for ourselves. And eventually, like, that is the logic. And if you look at, JD Vance, everyone in my Ohio town, they're all out of work. And, it used to be that there was the steel mill here and now there's not the steel. Like that's the logic that these guys are going with. Now, the problem is, like, you're going to have a huge surge in inflation on day one, and very likely, U.S. businesses are not going to go out and invest in these things because they are already maxed out. Most of them don't even do this stuff. So the tariff thing, like, I'll just leave it there because I don't want to go on and on. But that's the shorthand version of how to think about the tariffs.
Yeah, before we leave it, sort of two little questions. The first is, you're assuming a massive increase in inflation overnight as a result of the tariffs. Is it possible to get a scenario where prices increase so much that it actually causes deflation, like that it actually causes a recession because prices increase and also no one is making the stuff, so it just like completely goes bonkers and we're actually looking at the downside scenario? Does that question make sense?
Absolutely. And that's getting to the investment issue, because all of this is about what do businesses expect. And I think if you were to ask, like, just go ask any large US business, do they want a 10% across the board tariff? With a very small number of exceptions, like the US steel companies and, people who are always complaining about foreign competition and stuff like that, the vast majority of US businesses will be very upset, because essentially, and this is like, if you look at the narrative around stocks and what companies are saying right now, like the US consumer is already being squeezed by inflation. That is what businesses are most worried about. And the businesses that are reducing their investment now are reducing it for that reason. So you're going to just accelerate that process. Businesses are going to react psychologically in a very negative way, not in a positive way to this, and you're going to shoot yourself in the foot if you implement these tariffs. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, so here's the devil's advocate, because it's not like the current White House has been a white knight of free trade. So in May, the White House announced a bunch of tariffs. So they increased the tariff rates on semiconductors from 25 to 50%. EVs, the rate's going to go from 25% to 100% this year. Batteries, battery components and parts, critical minerals. So lithium ion batteries went from 7.5% to 25%. Battery parts, 7.5% to 25%. Tariff rate on graphite and permanent magnets is going from 0 to 25% over the next 2 years. For other critical minerals, going from 0 to 25% just in this year alone. Tariff rate on solar cells from 25 to 50%. Ship to shore cranes from 0% to 25%. The one that when this happened in May, the one that stuck out most to me was the tariff rates on syringes and needles is going from 0 to 50% this year, and also on other personal protective equipment. I didn't even tell you this. I went out in my personal account and bought some Becton Dickinson right then and there, because they're the only ones that make needles and syringes. So I was like, all right, like let's play roulette here. Like that seems like the easy thing to say. All of which is to say, you haven't gotten massive increases in these things yet. It hasn't, like semiconductors are to the moon, Nvidia and everything else. Like they're rolling out solar prices keep going down. I get calls 4 times a day for, can I install cheap solar on your house there in New Orleans? Like we're not feeling it quite yet. So how do we explain the reaction to those pretty significant tariffs that the Biden administration pointed out versus what we're talking about? Is it something about the blanket tariffs that make it different? Is it just the size of the tariffs themselves? Like, how is that different from what Biden has done, at least in the last couple months?
There's two big differences. The first is the absolute size is vastly different. Like semiconductors and solar panels and ship to shore cranes and syringes are barely a pimple on the butt of the US economy and the average consumer's basket. So to compare, graphite versus 10% blanket tariffs on every goddamn thing that you buy in your basket, that's a big difference, right? Just that alone. The second thing is the timing. I think to a great extent, the administration has felt comfortable doing these tariffs because it's easy, because those areas have all been in investment booms anyway, and they've just sort of accelerated them. So like semiconductors are doing very much their own thing because of the cycle that they exhibit no matter what. And obviously we've talked about the AI and how that's been a boom cycle now turning to bust. But it's a very different prospect when you're doing things that aren't, absolutely frothy. So those are two big differences, and I think, it makes it an apples to oranges comparison. But I think a very important one, because the new administration is going to say, oh, well, they did it, and that, the same line of argument, um, without realizing, oh, that's a it's a different time and it's a different thing, and that's going to have very different results.
Okay. Let's turn away then from tariffs and maybe talk about let's talk about the dollar, because this is in some ways the most interesting and confusing thing that's being talked about, and I don't have a good firm read on it. I don't even think that Trump's potential trade officials have a good view on exactly what it's going to do. There was a big report in Nikkei, but a bunch of different papers have had this, where they're talking about devaluing the U.S. dollar, and they've got Robert Lighthizer out there talking about how they could use tariff negotiations or unilateral moves or trade negotiations to devalue the U.S. dollar, whether that's unilaterally or via agreements and things like that. But here, I'll just read my favorite quote from this article. Each of the former officials stressed that all of the quote unquote nuances of the currency policies are not worked out yet and could shift before or after the election, which tells me they don't even know what the heck they're going to be doing or how they're going to do it. But it does seem clear if you read Vance, if you read the tea leaves of Trump's comments, and he's been flirting with Bitcoin lately too, which is its own rabbit hole that we could go down. You've got Lighthizer out here talking about the US dollar. There seems to be some awareness in the Trump camp and in Trump's mind himself that, okay, the tariffs that we did the first time around didn't actually do what we wanted. We were playing whack-a-mole, and it benefited Vietnam and Japan and South Korea and El Salvador and all these other countries. The real problem is the US dollar, and we're going to have to use US economic and political might to forcibly devalue the US dollar. So I'll set the stage for you there, because I don't understand how they're going to do it. I understand why it's something that is desirable, but it's also desirable that Annie wants a cow in our front yard in New Orleans. It's a great idea. I'd love to have fresh milk too, Annie, but go from there.
We'll start with the cow.
Yeah, please.
There's so many places we could go with this. I'm going to struggle to even, kind of wrap it into something that you can tell a story about. Let's just start by saying, I think the desire to change the role of the dollar in the U.S. or in the international financial system is born out of good ideas, because that is sort of the running sore of the post-World War II system that has never been addressed and has been causing problem after problem after problem. So the fact that new people are coming in with ideas to significantly change that, I think at its base is a good thing. Now, that's the last positive thing I'm going to say about what these guys are proposing, because there's a number of issues. There's implementation issues, there's political issues, and then there's the issues of the things that they're proposing to do won't do what they want them to do. So let's start with the implementation issues, because I think this is really relevant. Getting back to my friend Jay Powell, who I admire very much, as you know, the Fed is an independent institution by design. Jay Powell has the primary mandate of, encouraging price stability, equally with unemployment. But right now, unemployment is not the issue by any remote stretch of the imagination. Just to let people know, unemployment today is 4%. So we're not worried about unemployment, we're worried about inflation. So currency policy is the remit of the Treasury Department. That's a political decision. But monetary policy is the remit of the Fed. That causes an issue, because, say, in a hypothetical scenario where Trump is elected and, say, Robert Lighthizer becomes the Secretary of the Treasury, he could go out tomorrow and say, we want to issue US dollars until the dollar gets to, let's $1.50 to the euro, which today it's about $1.08 to the euro, right? If they were to do that, the Fed would almost certainly have to just push in the opposite direction, because that is going to increase inflation, and it's going to increase inflation expectations. Getting back, we could talk about the last time the U.S. devalued, which I think has some lessons, but it's also a very different scenario. Back in the late 60s and culminating with Nixon's move in 1971. The thing that was very similar back then was that a deliberate devaluation unleashed inflation expectations on the part of US consumers. And we talked about this last week. By the way, in the few hours after we recorded last week, the inflation expectation numbers came out for June. And even though the median inflation expectation for the long term, I'm sorry, this is 5 to 10 year inflation. What do the consumers, the US consumers surveyed, expect the inflation rate to be over 5 to 10 years? And the median is 2.9%, which is still elevated. It's not come down at all, even though inflation has come down quite a bit. And that's significantly higher than it was a few years ago. So we're sort of hovering at this plateau that's higher than what we've seen. The more interesting and concerning thing, we talked last time about the difference between the median and the average response. The average response is going off the rails. It was up again. I don't have the number in front of me, but it was like 5.9%. So if in like lest that seem like, oh, whatever, just some outliers, like that is a very concerning data point. And lest you think that I'm just some crank who's finding some data point to talk about, and oh, well, the Fed isn't even talking about this. I'll just repeat, the Fed is not going to talk about this. They are not going to say anything about inflation expectations until it cannot be ignored anymore. Because as soon as they start shifting their language to talk of inflation expectations, the whole algorithm of the show and dance, the song and dance around the Fed meeting, and oh, we're going to cut, and what's the timing? Is it September? Like the whole narrative changes, and we're in a whole new ballgame. And that alone is going to contribute to higher inflation expectations. So, you start getting into mirrors pointing at mirrors in this business. But that
Well,
is,
no, and I'm glad you brought that up, because to your point, while that's happening, everybody's talking about Powell's congressional testimony and him calling the economy boring and things like that, and talking like the headlines are back with rate cuts are back in the air. Like if we're right about these things, so let's say it all happens. Let's say Trump marches in via a landslide and the tariffs go into place and a massive increase in inflation goes up. They're not going to cut rates then, but that seems to be what everybody is positioning for.
yeah, like we said last week, if you're positioning in long-term bonds because you think, oh, we're heading into a cyclical slowdown and they're going to start cutting rates and that's going to start the next cycle, I think that's a mistake. And you're right. Um, he's very unlikely to go into a sustained rate cutting cycle if this political outcome happens. And you just have to, like, we don't have to speculate. Everyone seems to forget. But look at 2018. Trump was yelling at Powell, week by week. And Powell held his ground and was raising rates into 2018, in response to the huge fiscal stimulus of the Tax Act, in response to the tariffs. Inflation at that point, labor wage inflation was starting to really accelerate. Um, so you have to expect the same thing is going to happen today. So that's the implementation issue, which is you don't have everyone on the same page here. That's a problem in the first place, and that's going to have implications for asset prices. Um, the second one is the political issue, which is getting to what I sort of spoke about last week, which is that I think Trump's power lies in emotional resonance, let's just say. And I don't think if they implement a policy that in theory is going to, improve the trade deficit, like the average American doesn't give two shits about the trade deficit. They don't even know what that is. They care about, what is the price at the grocery store, how much is in their paycheck, and what is, their general kind of feeling about how the country is going. So if you implement, a significant dollar devaluation, or you say for the first time, hey, we're going to, follow a deliberate policy to weaken the dollar over time, you're going to have an inflation surge, all else equal, and voters are not going to like that. They're already pissed off about inflation, and they're blaming, the and partly, with good reason, but they're blaming the current administration. Uh, I don't think that's going to win you a popularity contest by pursuing that policy in a period of 4% unemployment. It would be different if the economy was running really loose and we had a ton of excess capacity, and it was, hey, we just, like, that is the 1933 devaluation, where you have a debt deflation and you need to devalue to jumpstart the economy. We're in the opposite scenario right now. We're in more like the 1968 to 71 scenario, where things are running really hot. People are starting to say, oh, shit, like this isn't too sustainable. And inflation expectations are starting to get untethered from sort of the boring, normal reality. And I think Powell uses that term very deliberately because he would love for things to be boring. And the one thing we can absolutely guarantee for the next 10 years is that it's not going to be boring.
Yeah, where I would push back against you, and this is where I always go back to Max Weber's definition of political charisma, which is that a figure or a demagogue that has charisma is able to make people think or believe things that are not in their own best interest. And we've already seen this with Trump. We saw this with Trump in cycle one. I vividly remember these videos where they went out and people were so happy that he was going to get rid of Obamacare. And then they would say, well, they'd be interviewing the people that voted for him. And they'd be like, oh, this is great. He's going to finally get rid of Obamacare. This is great. And then they'd say, well, what are you going to do without health care? You have health care through Obamacare. And the voter would be like, no, I don't. And it would be like, yeah, you do. Like, you just lost your health care because you voted for this thing that you thought was terrible. So I think you're overselling. Like, maybe that would lead to a bad outcome for Trump years down the road. But if he comes from the landslide, he's going to have at least 2 years to do whatever he wants, even if people are upset. And probably he has shown us he's got enough charisma where he can do these are not the tariffs you're looking for move. And people just kind of roll with it because they're like, no, he's a revolutionary figure. He's fighting the deep state. Any progress that hasn't happened is because of the deep state that tried to kill him. But he's the one who's pushing forward. So I think he'll have more slack there. But I also wanted to ask you, you said the last time the U.S. devalued and you brought up Nixon and the gold standard, but why didn't you go to the 85 Plaza Accords? Because that's the thing that Lighthizer keeps on talking about. He keeps on talking about using the threat of tariffs to get U.S. allies at the table to all agree to devalue against the U.S. dollar. It seems to me the big difference here is that, the big country that the United States was dealing with at that time was Japan. And Japan doesn't have a military, was defeated soundly by the United States a couple decades before, only had an economy rebuilt on the back of the United States government. So when the U.S. said, do this or else, they had to fall in line. The thing is, if you want a new Plaza Accords, the country you need to agree to do all this is China. And there's no way that China is going to be at the seat of the table for the Plaza Accords. But that seems to me to be the last devaluation attempt. And maybe the China thing is why it can't happen again. But curious why you went Nixon and not Plaza.
Before I want to talk about the Plaza Accords, but just on the other thing, I think the difference between the Obamacare thing and what we're talking about is the time lag is flipped, because now if you were to devalue the dollar or jack up tariffs or whatever it may be, you're hoping for long-term benefits, and that's what you're pitching, and you have immediate short-term pain. That's the difference between some of the other things, and you can convince people about anything in the long term and have them hope for something that's going to emerge, but you can't have them ignore what's hitting them today. So that's the only kind of point I would make about that. On the Plaza Accord, the reason why I don't bring that up is because it's so silly to compare today to the Plaza Accord that I don't even know where to start. So the situation back then was the opposite of today. Then we were sort of mired in a deep sort of slowdown, deep recession. We had excess capacity sitting around. Like, it's easy to forget, but the early 80s recession was, since the Great Depression, the biggest, most traumatic, most difficult industrial recession that the U.S. has experienced. In the unemployment rate in the early 80s was 11%. That's huge. That's huge. And in the industrial economy especially, it was significantly higher than that, because all of the inflation tearing through the system had absolutely gutted everything, in manufacturing and distribution and building. I mean, it was a nightmare. So that was the background. And basically what the US said to Japan was, hey, if you want to continue selling us stuff, we need to fix this, because we're going to, people were expecting the next Great Depression. In fact, there were a number of books that came out throughout all the 80s. There's actually a very famous book called The Great Depression of 1990, written by some guru guy. It was like the fourth turning of its day.
Oh God! Don't get me started. I was going to bring that up. We'll get there. Go ahead.
We'll get there. But people were saying this throughout the whole 80s. That was the depth of have you seen pictures of New York City in 1980? Like, Jesus Christ! Like, even Robert Mapplethorpe could afford to live in Manhattan. Like, that's how bad things were. So the point is, like, that was us coming to Japan, who was literally under our thumb, as you point out, and say, hey, Japan, if you don't help us fix this, there's going to be no America to sell stuff to. And, we had the Plaza Accord. And the funny thing is, it didn't change or fix anything, because at the same time that Japan agreed to the Plaza Accord and agreed to revalue the yen, they absolutely jacked up their credit growth and said, okay, well, we're going to offset this by having this huge credit boom. And that was what put the Japanese bubble into the final stages of, hysteria, like absolutely through the moon blow off time. So it didn't really help the US very much at all in the long term, and it didn't have a very long effect. So even though it's like something that we think about a lot, the Plaza Accord, it was like, in terms of actual effect on things for the broader US economy relative to 1971, relative to 1933, it doesn't hold a candle. I think that's the way I would think about it.
All right. Well, let's try on a crazy idea, and maybe this is crazy, because you're right that the United States had Japan under its thumb in a certain sense, but that's also technically true of China today. China still is, I don't want to use the word dependent, but China exports a lot of goods to the United States, even despite the trade war that's begun. What stops the United States from going to China and saying, okay, we have threatened you with the 60% tariffs. We're taking out the biggest hammer we possibly can, unless you come to the table and do some things that we want, which will include whatever is on Trump and Vance's grab bag, which is buy more U.S. ag supplies, or even, I don't know, invest in U.S. infrastructure, blah, 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 blah. Like, what's to stop the United States from going to China and using the 60% tariff as a negotiation? And what if the rest of the decade is some kind of economic arrangement between the two powers, rather than the Thucydides trap and World War III and Taiwan and everything else? Because if you're pro Trump's policies towards China and you're not a hawk, I think that must be what you're thinking. You're thinking that the threat is going to be able to make China come to the table in a way that China wouldn't come to the table for anybody else. Is that crazy, or is that on your bingo card?
Let's be clear that China is the most vulnerable in this situation. It's always the current account surplus nation that's the most vulnerable when these shifts happen. That's not to say that they're going to be clobbered by this, though. And what I mean is, the US can't unilaterally go after one country with the tools that it has. Look at what's happened. I mean, in small scale, the US did raise tariffs on China in a meaningful way. And all they did was trade is diverted around through other countries. Look at the growth in imports from Mexico and countries like that. So, trade settles multilaterally, and the tools that the US is trying to apply are unilateral. So, say the US comes out tomorrow and puts a 100% tariff on every import from China. Well, unless you're going to do that to every other trade partner, look at what's happened with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, everyone has seen the charts of all of the amazing, miraculous exports that have gone from all of these supposed U.S. allies to places like Kyrgyzstan and, Azerbaijan. That oh wow, Azerbaijan's buying an awful lot of stuff all of a sudden. Like, yeah, trade settles multilaterally.
Let's call them out. Like, these countries, it's an awful lot of BMWs and Mercedes Benz. Okay. German car companies. I don't want to hear any lectures from the Germans ever again. Sorry, go
on. Yeah, but it's true. But it works the same way on the U.S. side. So I don't want to downplay China's weakness, because they are vulnerable in any sort of global shift. But the U.S. cannot really take a Plaza Accord approach to one country and say, hey, you better do this, otherwise we're going to smack you with the tariffs, because China, I mean, they understand, and I mean, they wouldn't do it anyway. I mean, even if it didn't work like this, but they understand that the U.S. doesn't have that unilateral power. What the U.S. can do, and what would really damage China's interests in a major way, is if they did a multilateral thing. So across the board tariffs or dollar devaluation, all these things that we talked about, like, are not politically palatable in the current circumstances and would have very negative effects. Those are the sorts of things that could meaningfully change the US's trade position with the rest of the world, which by definition would include China. Now, the problem from the Chinese perspective is, and the difference is, if you were to go to the Plaza Accord, for instance, the U.S., I mentioned Japan cranked up the machines in 1985, and they said, okay, we're going to have a stronger yen. Well, let's party like it's 1999. That was, I'm being facetious, but Japan was doing that in part because the U.S. said, hey, you got to crank up your own demand because we want to export to you. And Japan said, okay, well, let's order bank loan acceleration and make it happen. The problem is that China's already done that. China's already spent its bullets. And this is getting to all the issues that we've talked about with treadmill to hell and malinvestment and credit-driven growth and too much debt. China's problem is lack of demand, internal demand. And now they're coming up against these difficult comps because they've pushed on these levers for so many years, they're running out of ability to do that. And that puts them in a very difficult position because China's current account surplus has actually increased significantly in recent years, which is extraordinary. Like, this sounds like, oh, the surplus, and what is that again, and the percentages. Just to put this into context, no economy that's the size of China has ever had a current account surplus anywhere close to what they've done, not even in the same ballpark. The scale of the distortion in the economy is such that it really ripples across the whole world. So these aren't little adjustments we're talking about. We're talking about this is the basic structure of the global economy, right? So the only way that China can rebalance that is they need to have demand internally go up relative to supply. They need to consume more relative to what they're producing. But they can't do it through credit. They can't do the Japan, crank up the machines approach because they've been doing that. And now that's done. So they're in a very difficult position where they're trying to restructure the nature of the economy while, not being able to just juice demand and then facing these sort of political pressures because supply is still churning out goods that they're exporting. And that's a big source of continued employment in the country. So not a situation I would want to be the guy who has to figure out how to fix, but
yeah, not at all. And I mean, arguably the most important thing that happened this week, aside from the stuff we've already talked about, was you probably saw China's new home prices fell at the fastest pace in 9 years in June. New home prices down 4.5% year on year. That's deeper than the slide in May. Also, second quarter growth surprised to the downside. It's the slowest since the first quarter of 2023. So it looked like maybe China had put the Band-Aid on it, that the Band-Aid was holding. Just sitting here on July 18th, looks like they're going to need a new Band-Aid, or something else is going to have to change because the treadmill just sped up a little bit. We could be here like all day, and we're going to check in weekly. And this conversation is going to last for weeks and months as we go into a time of pretty big change. But let me try and put this together, or at least let's start thinking about where we go from here, because I'm not sure what this means for the macro picture. I'm listening to what you're saying, and I could say, well, you know what? Tariffs are probably a sure thing, and the currency stuff is less certain. So let's say that the tariffs do go into focus, and let's say that you take money out of U.S. households into U.S. businesses, and let's say you do get some maybe misguided rate cuts. Well, then that should be a high octane fuel for the market. We could be off to the races, and we could be in a roaring 20s type situation where you might want to enjoy the boom right now and then time it right so that when the whole thing comes crashing down in 3 or 4 years or whatever it is, you get out before the crash, sort of thinking about it that way. You could say, okay, the tariffs are going to go in place, but they're not going to do what they expect. Inflation is going to surge, and the bond market's going to freak out, and the market is going to go down, and we're going to be in disaster zone. So gather your powder and get on the sidelines, sell your NVIDIA and whatever else you've done, and maybe take a little bit of a breather. Or maybe devaluation of some sort could happen, or maybe even the rumor of devaluation means maybe take some speculative positions in the yen and the yuan and some of these other currencies, and maybe just the the threat of devaluation is going to lead to some outsized jumps in some of these ways. And look for those foreign markets that are going to be the ones that benefit most, because it's not like all this manufacturing is going to come back to the United States. It's not. It's probably going to go to places like Mexico, or Costa Rica or Brazil, or markets like that. So find the diamonds in the rough in those particular economies, because those are the ones that no matter what happens here, there's going to be money and interest going into those. Maybe this is a scenario I haven't thought of here, but tell me which of those you're leaning towards, or if it's none of the above, or if we haven't even scratched the surface enough to get to that point.
Yeah, I mean that's a tricky one. What I would say is this: as far as actual implementation and what to do, and we talked about this a little bit last week. I know I always feel like I'm like lecturing here, um, but the real world implications I think are pretty simple. Like no matter what happens, everything that I'm trying to describe is a sort of manifestation of the U.S. and its changing role in the world. Like this is coming back to the multipolarity argument and kind of that core thesis that the US has its tentacles stuck, like policy tentacles, institutional tentacles stuck in that post World War II world. Like we're still just consuming capital from all over the world. The dollar's being pushed up by capital flows and sort of the Chinese model. And we've reached these just ridiculous extremes that are already have been breaking down for years. So all of this is a manifestation of the U.S. trying to find its new place in this multipolar world order. And it's hard to know exactly how that's going to progress. Like we're probably going to make mistakes. We're probably going to, have policy errors that lead to deep recessions or inflation, becoming unhinged for some period at least. I think that's very likely. Like when I say, what you can bet on is that things aren't going to be boring. I think that's very much true. Like volatility, both measured in asset prices and measured in sort of societal volatility, is going to be up and probably move higher as we go on because volatility clusters. So I said this is a tangible application. What I mean by this is all of this, I think, is supportive of that core thesis that if you are an investor, and not only like investing your assets, but just thinking of plan B, residency, whatever, and I don't mean just the US, like you want to be thinking about how do you adapt to that multipolar world and how do you diversify across these different geographies? Because it truly is a situation where the US is not going to be the top dog. I mean, we may remain the top dog, but relatively, it's going to be more even. And this is sort of the ugly working out, the sort of adolescent years as we morph into a new kind of different system.
Anything else we missed? Or should we leave it there?
Oh man. No, I guess I've droned on enough for one class.
I don't think it's droning at all, and I don't want to be too self-congratulatory, but I mean, like one of the reasons we started this podcast was because, at least on my end, I wasn't getting this type of analysis from the places that I was looking for, so I wanted a podcast that provided it. I cannot find people talking about these things. Like one of the things that makes me so sure that a lot of the things that we've talked about are probably right is because not a lot of people are talking about them. Everybody else is out there about politics and what's this going to mean for the next 6 months and blah, blah, blah. We talked about the guy yesterday who was trying to talk my ear off about Tesla. But it's almost like the problems that we're dealing with are too big for the individual mind to comprehend. So that's why we're here. And, just look at how much has changed in just the last 2 to 3 weeks. For all we know, something terrible is going to happen a week from now that'll completely change the race, and we'll have to reevaluate going forward, which is why I won't leave without getting this shot in at the fourth turning. Everybody keeps talking about the fourth turning. So I you know what I did? I was like, you know what? There must be something of value in here. I'm going to go back and reread it because I last reread it like 5 or 6 years ago. And full disclosure, like I'm trying. It's hard to find the time, but I'm trying to make progress on writing a book here that sort of puts together my views. And one of the chapters is going to be a takedown of Peter Zeihan and of Neil Howe. So you have that to look forward to. But I reread the intro for The Fourth Turning, and I'm sorry, I just don't understand how they got this reputation of being these master forecasters. Everything was wrong. And they've moved the goalpost on their predictions 10 years and saying, well, now the fourth turning's coming. We said it was going to happen by 2025, but it hasn't happened yet. But now we're in the fourth turning because Trump and the assassination and this, that, or the other thing. Just the comparison to the McKinley administration. You can't do that with the fourth turning because that was a third turning. So, of course, there's a difference between a third turning versus a fourth turning and a saeculum and these cycles and the blah, 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 blah. And that seems to be what passes for analysis these days. Anyway, I've met Neil Howe once or twice before. I'm sure he's very nice, and I think he's a serious scholar in general. But beware academics peddling prophecies. The one thing I know for certain is that if somebody has a really clear idea of what's going to happen next, they're probably wrong.
Well, just to jump on that for 1 minute, because I want to end on a positive note, but just on this subject too, I want to point out, like you talked last week about reading books. Like one of my weird little hobbies is I like to find really old books that had predictions that were just super wrong. So like I mentioned, like the Great Depression of 1990, I read that book cover to cover because it's very interesting to see where they were wrong. And this guy, Ravi Batra, was in the 1980s. He wrote The Great Depression of 1990. And then he wrote another one that was, The Downfall of Capitalism and Communism. And it's the same thing, like, in a 10-year cycle and does this. And before that, there was a book called The Fourth Wave, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
This is another, not the fourth turning, the Great Wave. The Great Wave, that's what it's called. And a similar sort of thing. Like you have the first wave, and then it's the peasants, and the second wave, and then it's the bourgeoisie, and the third. Like it's all kind of Marxists, dressed up in new garb, like historical cycles and Kondratiev cycles and all this bullshit. It's bullshit, and it's there to entertain you because it's, it is what it is.
My favorite in this genre, I mean, the population explosion also bears mentioning in this genre, and anything Malthus wrote also is great in this genre. But my favorite is the guy who set me on this career path. George's best book is not The Next 100 Years. His best book is The Coming War with Japan, because he was totally fucking wrong, but he actually develops all of his ideas and does a lot of interesting research. And most of the geopolitical tools that I learned to use, I learned not from any of George's later work. I learned from The Coming War with Japan, which was completely wrong.
It's a collector's edition now. But just to end on the positive note, because I feel like the last couple of conversations we've had have been really gloomy, and I come away thinking like, oh, geez, like devaluation and fat people and assassinations and the revolt of the masses. Like I feel like I'm turning into one of those tinfoil hat guys. But I just want to reiterate, like all of this is good in the end. I think it's all good. And we talk about, Ortega Gasset and that period and how horrible it was, and but the underlying reality is like life for so many people got so much better so fast, as all of that shit was going on, and like we're experiencing similar things today. Like unless a nuclear war happens, or like truly a scenario that puts development globally just completely out of whack, like all of the underlying trends are really, really good. And a lot of what we talk about as like even devaluation is just recognizing the stupid shit you did in the past. Like it's like Walter Baggett said, a crisis is not the destruction of wealth, it's a recognition of the wealth that's already been destroyed. And when we think about debt is going up and the US dollar and Bitcoin and gold, like all of this is sort of cleaning out the system. It's like a juice cleanse for the global financial economy, and in the end, it's a good thing, even though it could be annoying and painful as you're actually going through it. So I just want to leave on that note, because like the future's so bright, you got to wear shades, even while we're kind of amusing ourselves, focusing and talking about the negative stuff, because as the fourth turning points out, that stuff's interesting to think about.
Yeah. If I didn't have to put Trump in the title of this podcast for clicks, I would make "Juice Cleanse for the Economy" the title of the episode. So I'll put that there for posterity's sake. That was great. And but before we leave it, because I just want to respond to one thing that you said. This was actually the one part of the fourth turning intro that I thought had some value. It's not original Howe's work. I actually think Leo Strauss was the one who laid this out the best, but you can read a lot of different philosophers to think about this. But they talk about three different categories of time in history, and that we begin with chaotic time, where there is no such thing as history. There's just events that happen. We have no narrative. We have no meaning. Then they have cyclical time, which they associate with the ancients, so ancient Greece and those before. And then linear time, which is everything is going up and to the right, really and truly progressivism. And there is something to be said for linear time and positivism and forward progress being wrong, because you can sort of the future can be bright and things like that, but it's not, everything doesn't always go linearly up. You can have periods of up and periods of down, even if in the long term things are getting better, or maybe in the long term things won't get better. It's just from our perspective over the last 300 years, if you use basic indicators, whether it's health, lifespan, literacy rates, rights for women, like we're so much better than we were 200 years ago, and we'll probably be better in 50 years than we will today because of all the urbanization and modernization that's going to be happening in Southeast Asia and Africa and things like that. So I think there is something to be said for the problem with optimism is that it can get thrown in with progressivism. And there's something has happened in our society too with how we think about these things, where that has sort of infected things. And this is one of the things that Howe is pushing back on. Now, the problem is that Howe wants to go back to ancient cyclical time. So he literally wants to put us back in the cave and wants us to start doing cycles and mumbo jumbo and things like that. So I think there's something to be said for rejecting that association of linear time and just assuming that things are going to go in a different direction. I think the wrong thing to do, though, is to say, aha, the ancients had it right. So let's go back to what the ancients said, and we'll start reading the tea leaves and consulting the Oracle of Delphi on the saeculum that's going to happen every 91 fucking years. Like that it seems to me is the wrong path. But I do think there's a warning signal with the future is so bright that the shades are going to be on. Maybe in 20 years, maybe in 10 years, maybe us sitting here in our current demographics, that's true. But I think one of the reasons that we've been downbeat on the podcast for the last couple of episodes is that because change means there's also going to be losers. And when you start thinking about the countries or the people or the demographic classes that are going to lose from some of this volatility and some of those changes, there's real change there as well. And I can tell that just from the uptick of people writing in who, for a long time were just listeners or something like that, but they're okay, like what is going on? I've lost all sense of where we're going from here. So keep the shades in your pocket for when the sun gets a little too bright, even if the sun is always going to come up the next day, is what I was trying to get to.
I think that's a good one to end it on.
Okay, juice cleanse over. We will see you guys next week. Cheers. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.